Morning. It's great to be with you. I'm going to share screen most of the time because it will keep me on track with my slides and my presentation. Otherwise, I'm likely to lose it and just go off on one. And we'll still be here with me doing my introduction in 40 minutes, which won't be any good. I want to start by saying my kind of love of stats and research goes back to the late 80s because I was part of a presentation that meant I was a stat or represented a group of young people. It was about 1989, and I was paraded across a platform with about 29 other young people, so 30 of us all together, to represent the young people that were leaving the church every week. So we walked up the side of this platform, walked along the stage, down the other side. We all had to do it quite solemnly with our heads bowed. And it was just an indication of, for each one of us, 10 young people were leaving the church. So 300 young people leaving the church every week. And it was a prayer meeting of a dozen churches that got together across North London. Now, I have to say, my confession is in 1989, I was already 21. So I wasn't being paraded as a young person. I was being paraded because we couldn't find enough young people. So a dozen churches in a busy, populous area of North London couldn't find 30 young people from amongst them, so they had to resort to a few young adults like myself. But since then, I've kind of grappled with what are we doing as church? How have we landed ourselves in this situation where we can't hang on to young people, that they're leaving and disappearing? And in fact, as we went into the 90s, there was an exciting dynamic about the Church of England heading into the decade of evangelism, until we reached the end of the decade of evangelism and discovered that 1,000 young people were now leaving the church every week. Across that decade, the Church of England on its own lost 500,000 young people. I don't quite know how that happened in the decade of evangelism when you'd think we'd grow, but that's what took place. And I guess ever since, I've been following really closely stats and research and trying to make sense of what's happening in the church, what's happening in the world, how those two spaces connect, and our thinking. Before we get into some stats and research, particularly, I just want to highlight a kind of couple of caveats. Firstly, I'm not covering everything there is to cover in the last decade. Loads of things have come out, loads of reports have been written. I'm trying to pull together a few to sort of navigate through a story, if you like, of where I think we've got to. It's quite subjective because it's my perspective, so I'd encourage you to read all of the reports I mention and the ones I don't, and make up your own minds about what they're telling us about where we're at as the church in terms of engaging in our contemporary culture with children, young people and families. But that's my first caveat. I'm not covering all the ground. I want to focus in on three particular reports, which I'll get to in the middle of my presentation. But the other caveat is a warning. Not all stats can be taken as read. So I'll give you an example. This stat continues to do the rounds. I've seen it lots since it was first published, as far as I know, in this Promise Keepers workbook back in 1996. When I first read it, something instinctively in me didn't like it. I think partly as a children's and youth worker, I just didn't feel that the stat represented reality in terms of my own practice, what I'd seen and what I'd heard. I don't need to read it out to you because hopefully you can see it on the screen. But I just did a bit of digging just to find out kind of what is the truth behind this stat. So I got the Promise Keepers workbook. What was interesting is in the book, nowhere does it mention what the stat's quoted on one page, but with no evidence, no corroborating research, no reference to anything. It just sits there as its own thing. Every other statement where there is a quote or a reference to statistics does have something linked to it, apart from this one quote. So that immediately made me suspicious. I then went on a hunt to try and find where it was that this was from. And I found some websites that were referring to it. But again, all they did was point to where it was quoted in the Promise Keepers workbook. So nobody seemed to have done the work that said this is the research that this stat is based on. So I then went to Barna because in America, one of the places people said, look at this research, Barna did it. I went to Barna and asked them, did you do this piece of research? And this is what they said to me. Thank you for your interest, which is very, very polite of them to start with. They were basically, no, we didn't publish it. We're aware of it. We've no idea where it came from, basically, is what they were saying to me. We do not have any information on this topic ourselves. And I started to think, well, okay, maybe this stat is real, but let's just have a think for a minute. How is it possible to determine whether this is true? On what basis are we saying that, once children attend, only 3% of families follow? In my ministry practice, I would say it's almost the other way round in terms of statistical engagement. I see children come to midweek clubs. I see families start to grow in their interest in the church and then join in with activities off the back of their children often having been first. I've rarely seen it the other way round. Yes, families might come together, but it's weird to have an individual turning up on their own and not bringing everybody with them. So that just makes it a little bit weird to me as well. But also, how do we know that the families are following? What does that even mean? Turning up at church doesn't make somebody a disciple. And yet I've often seen this as evidence for why we need to have men leading in ministry, because they're going to lead their families to Christ. It doesn't say anything about leading anybody to Christ. And yet that's often how I've seen it quoted. So even there, the stat's been twisted a little bit to mean something else. Attending church doesn't mean you're a Christian or you're a follower of Jesus. So for me, there's some real issues about this stat, partly because I can't find the research it was related to, and nobody seems to know. I've asked the Promise Keepers people themselves. They don't remember it and they can't locate it. So I've just those two caveats at the beginning then. I'm not doing everything in terms of research, but analyze, critique the research that you do read. Think, does this hold up? What's canon for us when it comes to looking at statistics and research? In fact, that word canon goes right back to first time it was used was with back when the gospel and the Bible was being put together, and it was determined what is canon in terms of scripture. And it's basically a measuring rod, was where the Greek Hebrew word comes from for canon. So for me, in terms of statistics, I'm thinking, what's our measuring rod? How can we measure things in a way that helps us understand what we're doing? And some statistics are really helpful for that. Others, if we suspect there's something not quite right, we need to interrogate those and find out where they've come from. So I'm going to dig into a few stats that I think are helpful for us as we think about children's and family ministry. And here's one from John Walker. He wrote a small paper in 2011 for his diocese in Canterbury, Last Chance Saloon it was called. And in it he says 90% of adults attending church had also attended as children. Now this stat stands out to me. I think, whoa, that is a significant number. I've now put into my own kind of informal statistical research. Every time I go and speak somewhere, I won't do it today because it will be a bit hard to work it out on Zoom. But every time I go somewhere, generally, I ask this question: how many of you were in church as children? Went to Sunday school, went to a kids club that was associated with church. I've never been anywhere and spoken anywhere where the stat is not about 90%. Sometimes it's 100%, depending on the room. But it's never lower than that in my experience over the last 15 to 20 years asking that question. How many of you can identify with this? This is true for you. So for me, this stat stands up, not just for Diocese of Canterbury, looking at the Anglican Church, but I've asked this question in free churches, Baptist, Methodist, wherever I've gone and done training or done speaking. I've asked the question where I can, and this is generally what happens. 90% stick their hands in the air. Yep, that's me. In 2012, we'll come back to that stat in a second, but in 2012, 21st Century Evangelicals was a small piece of work done by the Evangelical Alliance. And they asked young people, young adults, basically, those in their early 20s, how did you come to faith? And 6% cited Alpha, Christianity Explored, or some similar course. 54% cited growing up in a Christian family or church environment. And I want us to remember that particular stat as we go through the rest of the statistics we look at, because it's key for me and flows right through the next decade of all that we've discovered and thought about when it's come to our mission with children, young people and families. Growing up in a Christian family and the wider church environment. Note that those young adults don't cite youth group. They don't talk about the age-specific activities they were in. They mention primarily growing up in a Christian family or church environment. And something like evangelistic courses or evangelistic outreach to young people doesn't have anywhere near the impact that our resources suggest it should have, because we spend an awful lot of money on doing evangelistic work, whether that's nationally or in local churches. So thinking back to the stat I just shared from John Walker, here's this next stat, which freaks me out when I put the two of them together. Just have a think about the two stats together. I'll flick between them. 90% of adults attending church had also attended as children. There are 6 adults in church to every 1 child or young person. Now, if that's true, we're going to be 6 times smaller by the time all these children have grown up than we are now. Because, most of the people that we have in church were in church as children. If we have a tiny number of children in church compared with the adults today, put those two stats together, we're in serious trouble unless we get better in engaging with children and families. And this is not the reason most of my research that digs into some detail is from the Church of England, is because more than any other denomination, it counts stuff. So it's very good at measuring a lot. So we get a really good set of data. In just this one survey, everyone counts, 600 churches were looked at in terms of the stats, and that's right across the country. So another advantage of the Church of England is the parish almost everywhere. So you're getting really good spread, urban, rural, suburban, poor, rich, everything in between. We're going to leap into 2014. This is quite a quick navigation, but I hope it's going to be helpful as we press into 3 reports that are coming up. But I just want to stop at the Pass It On. The Bible Society did this report back in 2014. And kind of the headline for me is, people really don't know their Bible. This wasn't just looking at Christian young people or Christian families. This was asking children and young people and parents, how do you engage with the Bible? What do you know about the Bible? Do you understand or know the stories? Just a couple of the stats from it. So a little kind of synopsis was given of different stories within Scripture, and people were asked to find or indicate whether or not they thought they were from the Bible or from somewhere else. So little synopsises, and 30% of parents didn't recognize Adam and Eve, 31% didn't recognize David and Goliath, 27% didn't recognize the Good Samaritan. And then interestingly, what they thought was in the Bible, Harry Potter in the Bible, Hunger Games, 54%, Superman's from the Bible, just a lack of knowledge, if you like. And then this, for me, was a little bit devastating, bearing in mind, I'm a children's and youth work practitioner. I've done a lot of stuff in schools, primary and secondary. 34% of 15-year-olds not heard, read, seen, know anything about the nativity story. For me, that's a bit of a wake-up call. I guess a question that makes me ask is, how many assumptions do I make about what the children and young people I'm working with know? Whether I'm doing outreach, whether I'm doing disciple making, intentional Bible study stuff, how much am I assuming knowledge? In fact, when it comes to reaching out and engaging with people outside the church, I think we've got a real challenge about how we do this. If, like me, you've been brought up in the church, there might be some challenges about how we communicate. When I was growing up, I was in a small Baptist church in North London. And I remember going along. Every Sunday I'd go through the doors, there'd be a deacon to welcome me. And as I went in, he would say to me, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? He asked me this question every Sunday I went to church. And I, having been steeped in the Bible at a Baptist church, I knew what that meant and what that was referring to. But imagine a young person of 15 thinking, I think I'm going to try out my local church. And they rock up just to have a look at what's going on. Think, I've heard hardly anything about the church, but I'm not doing anything. I'll turn up and see what happens. And there's a deacon to greet them or somebody else. And they ask them, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Now, most young people I know who aren't really engaged with church, and some I know who are, would phone the police off the back of that. And yet that for us in that church, it was just regular parlance to have that kind of conversation and talk about things in that regard. And yet, even with just something you would think as basic as the nativity, how many children, young people have just never heard the story? They don't know the good news that the angels talk about. We've already had it mentioned, the Evangel. We've already had that mentioned this morning. They don't know the basics of the good news. There is no meta-narrative that young people are growing up understanding. There isn't a Christian worldview that is seeped out into our culture because it's years, perhaps, third, fourth generation of parents who've not grown up with a church background. So that's the culture in which we're seeking to engage children, young people, and families. I'm reminded of Bob Mayo's book, written about 2014, actually, that was called Ambiguous Evangelism. And in it, Bob suggests that we need to do pre-evangelism because people don't have a Christian worldview. And maybe going back to that slide about Alpha, that reflects on the impact of Alpha or the lack of it amongst young people potentially, because they're not asking those questions, because their frame of reference isn't anywhere near where we would like it to be for those questions to be making sense to how they're journeying through life. And a lot of that for me is because of the lack of biblical literacy, just in culture in general. But also we have a short window of opportunity to engage effectively, I think, with children and young people. This was the stat they shared about the engagement just with reading. So 8-year-olds, 52%, reading regularly for pleasure, whether that's fiction or other things, because they want to. That drops to 13% by the time we hit 15-year-olds. So if we're keen on the Bible being read, we've got a challenge there, that the Bible just isn't something that's going to be accessed. And also fiction or any kind of reading isn't something that most young people are engaged with on a regular basis. So we've a challenge there if our traditional methods of passing out tracts or booklets or any kind of evangelistic engagement looks at whether we're using printed material and what kind of context we're trying to engage with young people. And actually the likelihood is they're not going to read. They're not reading anything. So we need to keep that in mind when we seek to do evangelism and witness. We're still in 2014 off the back of this came out later in the year, but it was based on some research that was carried out between 2011 and 2013 from Anecdote to Evidence. I love the title of this piece of research because it reflects what I know to be true in my knower as a children's and youth worker. Mike Pivac used to say, stuff you just know in your knower. And for me as a children's and youth work practitioner, I've known that I'm making a difference as a children's and youth worker. What Anecdote to Evidence did was find the evidence that shifted that anecdotal story about the impact of a children's worker or youth worker into some evidence-based stuff. And this for me was the standout stat. Youth and children's workers are the most effective type of lay workers for a growing church. I love that. So when this report came out, churches that would phone me up at the time I worked for the Church of England in Sussex, and churches would phone me up and say, tell me why I should think about children's and youth work or invest in a children's or youth worker. And I would often go, it's a no-brainer, and let me tell you why. But what really helped was off the back of the research, Anecdote to Evidence, I could look, read this. This will tell you how significant it is. Thousands of our churches have engaged with this research, and this is what we've found. Those that have a youth worker are more likely to be growing than those that don't to do it. I was maybe not quite as blunt as that with people on the phone, but I was basically saying you need to get on board. This is really important. However, it's got to be said alongside this, sometimes things look really shiny, and from Anecdote to Evidence was great because it had colorful infographics. It was easy to understand and read. The summary report just made real sense of the data and in nice little pictures, a bit like the Pass It On from the Bible Society. But tucked away at the same time was a report written by David Voas, who was one of the key people who led the research. And he wrote a paper at the time called Numerical Change in Church Attendance, National, Local and Individual Factors. Now, that doesn't sort of trip off the tongue like Anecdote to Evidence. But this is key for us as we think about children and young people in the church. He would argue the reason for decline, going back to all those figures I shared at the beginning, about thousands of children leaving the church. The reason for decline in affiliation attendance is a failure to replace older generations of churchgoers, not because adults are leaving. It's that half of the children of church-going parents do not attend when they reach adulthood. Half. Let me say that again. Half in capitals. Just, we have them, and then we don't have them as adults. 50-50 is the chance. And I was like, what is going on then? So at the same time, and this is where David Vass drew some of his references from when he wrote his report, the European Values Study was carried out in 2014, and it highlighted these things as qualities children can be encouraged to learn at home. Which, if any, it said to people, do you consider to be especially important? Please choose up to 5. And here's a list of qualities children can be encouraged to learn at home. Bosh. 94% good manners, 83% tolerance and respect for others, 11% religious faith, especially important to learn at home. So passing on faith at home, not a feature, not a factor. And you might think, yeah, but the European Values Study, surely that was Europeans across the board, that wasn't specifically church people. But this particular 94, 83, 11 is taken from 505 who profess to be Anglican Christians, saying this is there. So these are people who've said they're Christians. This isn't everybody. This is just the Christians who've said, well, actually, for us, it's not that important to pass on faith at home. Hold that alongside what I said about the importance of family and what the Evangelical Alliance said around the importance of the home and growing up in a Christian family and the Christian community. Because now we probably find, if there's one report or one piece of research, apart from obviously YFC's material that's about to come when they do their presentation, which of course is fantastic. But apart from that, if there's one thing that you get hold of that you've not, passing on faith, the report by Theos is really, really significant and should underpin the way we think about how we engage in disciple making with children, young people and families. So it's not just one report, it looks at 54 reports and then compiles all of that into a kind of, what are the key things that sort of stand out right from across all of these different pieces of work that they look at. So it's a comprehensive literature review, if you like, of surveys, studies, research that's been carried out. And Theos released it in 2016. But look at these key things that they say. Foundations for faith laid in childhood. Going back to that kind of the importance of parents, the importance of the home, and that growing up in a Christian family that the Evangelical Alliance mentioned. The role and responsibility of the family being central in faith transmission. And they mark that out as not just a theological assertion, but also an observation of child development, the significance of the home on just how children develop in terms of behavior, cognitive, emotional and mental maturity. And then enduring adolescent adult believers are largely, not exclusively, got to bear that in mind, but largely the product of caring, supportive, stable homes where faith is seen, heard and experienced. And then that last bit, parents need to be and do what they want their children to become. But the evidence tells us they're not. They're not. And that's a challenge for us. Again, in 2016 was a bumper year for things coming out that looked at what is going on for us that we need to engage with well. Rooted in the Church was a report, again from the Church of England, but this time looked specifically at the experience of children and young people within the church. And these were their key findings around what church should be like. The need to build a culture of intergenerational relationships. That for me, again, links back to the worshipping family, the worshipping community being key for young people from the EA's report just a few years earlier. Be inclusive of all ages in both leadership and worship. Recognize young people and young adults as equal members of the body of Christ. What worries me, or frustrates me, I suppose, is that even needs to be said in 2016. And again, as a practitioner, I'm like, well, I'll take that as read. But do church leaders take that as read? Is that something that's just a given, that young people equal members with us in the body of Christ. And then churches should become unconditionally welcoming places for young people. And this one I love: churches need to offer more support to their youth workers and their leaders. Absolutely. And then this stands out, and this almost could be exactly the same as the EA's report. Notice you've got Evangelical Alliance coming up with something that looks quite similar to this, alongside a very kind of Church of England, looking at the Church of England specifically, report, and yet they're effectively saying very similar things. The important place for young people in terms of being the whole church family, their preferred style of worship. And then while they value age-specific leadership and activities, they do not want to always be artificially separated from the main church. I think that's key for us to think about what our practice looks like for children, young people, and families. And then also 2016 saw Youthscape release the Losing Heart report. They looked at what was going on in churches across the country in terms of their activity with children and young people. And this is a bit of a critique of this piece of work. So bear with me, but I think it's important just to ask some questions that help us interrogate it a little bit. So one of the challenges for me with Losing Heart is what it doesn't really go into. So we have, if you read the report, there's 17 different kinds of activities that you could be doing. And they had two columns. They had children's activities, they had young people's activities. And then they put 17 different things that you could or couldn't be, you might or might not be doing with your children or young people. However, when it came to intergenerational activities, the only thing that seemed to feature was messy church. There's no mention of all age worship. There's no mention of parents at the home. There's no mention of support of young people beyond group or activity facilitated stuff that, again, is very specific to age groups. And for me, there's still a challenge around whether we're thinking of our ministry in a silo or whether we're thinking of our ministry as being holistic and needing to be intergenerational and connecting the dots. And for me, one of the kind of flaws in this piece of research was it just didn't interrogate what's going on outside of the regular activities to determine whether or not things were making a difference to the lives of children, young people and families in terms of their spiritual growth. In fact, there's a subjective thing that happens in this report because parents, families are asked, youth workers, children's workers are asked, what's effective in terms of your work with children, young people? They don't qualify what effective means. They just ask, do you think you're being effective, basically? And I think unless you qualify that statement, everybody's then subjectively thinking, what does effective mean to me? So I don't know that you can then draw from that some sensible conclusions. And actually, if you're a volunteer leading on children's and youth work, and you're asked whether your church is doing these 17 activities, and you think we're only doing 4, but I'm thinking, wow, 4? You're a volunteer and you're managing to manage 4 activities. That's incredible. You should be really chuffed. But when you've got a list of 17 and you're not doing 12, 13 of them, maybe you start to think, well, maybe not as effective we're supposed to be. Maybe I'm supposed to be doing all of these things. That doesn't really feature in the way the report's put together. So I feel like there's some good stuff to learn about how we think about children's and youth work. And are we still, it's only 2016, are we still thinking of those as separate spaces where children's work happens over here, youth work happens over here, somewhere else the adults are meeting, and we're not really thinking massively about intergenerational activity and where that's taking place. Now, maybe it's because we can't measure what's happening in the home. So we don't think about it because it's just too hard. We don't quite know how to quantify it or assess it. And then I just want to jump to a report that seems to slide in alongside the others. And if you don't read these or look at these, the Children's Society have produced the Good Child Report for a decade. So if you want something that kind of charts the emotional well-being and health of young people subjectively, because it's asking young people how they feel, that's the purpose of the report. What do young people feel about their lives today in terms of their own well-being? And what stood out for me, there was a BBC report back in 2018, and what it did was highlight all the kind of, young people are self-harming, this is happening for young people, their emotional well-being's not great. Tucked away in the BBC report was the impact that parents have and the closeness to mothers and fathers and the difference that makes to a child's well-being. So closeness to father. And this is from the Millennium Cohort Study. If you don't know what that is also really worth looking at. The problem with doing this piece of work for you is there's so many reports and stats. I just feel like this could just be information overload, but this stuff for me is really important. So the Millennium Cohort Study is looking at the lives of thousands of young people from roughly born between the years of 2000 2002. So it's a longitudinal study looking at their lives from there right through now. So think about how old they are. These are children age 14, but they've been tracking them for that length of time. Not very close to father, then that sense of well-being and how people feel in the family, their happiness within the family drops. It's feeling extremely close. It's right up there, 9.1. And then look at the difference for closeness to mother that makes for children and young people. The top figure, extremely close, still roughly the same for both boys and girls, male and female, 9.1, 8.9. But down at the bottom, 4.7, 5.9, not very close, has a real impact on the happiness and how those young people feel. This is just young people. This isn't about Christian young people, but it's worth remembering for us in our ministry, how do we engage well with the home? And that happiness that young people feel in the home, that place of safety they feel, that impacts our ability to do effective ministry with them. If they're not feeling great at home and they're coming with all that stuff to us at church, but we're doing ministry in a vacuum, we're doing children's work, we're doing youth work, we barely mention the home, we just work with the children, we're missing a huge part of what perhaps is going on for them in their lives. And we need to engage better, I think, with that. And then jumping to 2019, we're getting up to date, and very shortly I'm going to need to finish. But on the transmission of religion, the British Attitudes Survey, another key piece of research you should be looking at. I know this is like a lot, but it's really important stuff. National Centre for Social Research on the transmission of religion. Of those brought up Anglican, 47% still regard themselves as such. Remember me saying it's about 50-50? If two parents rocking up to church, their children are going to attend as adults, well, that stat bears that out. However, not if you're a Methodist. Sorry, but if those brought up Methodists, it's 27%. Of those brought up as a Muslim, 93% still identify themselves as such. What are we failing to do as the Christian community in terms of creating a kingdom culture and a Christian culture that means our children and young people grow up believing it, feeling it, knowing it in terms of their DNA, that they are Christians, they're followers of Jesus, they're part of the family of God. What is it the Muslims are getting right that we're not? Or is that the wrong question? But it's just important for us to pay attention to that and notice that. Right, we're nearly up to date. Just a couple of things to mention. Faith in the Nexus was a report that was done. It was going on pre-pandemic. So this piece of work was then produced during the pandemic in terms of the report was written, but all the research and much of the stuff that was taking place that led into the report was carried out pre. So it doesn't include some of the things I'm going to briefly mention as I finish. But just looking on Faith Talk in the Home. A key conclusion from their analysis was this, that children need to be viewed as active participants in religious socialization and spiritual development, rather than as more passive recipients of parental influence. So this kind of opens up for us what is happening in a different way. So I've mentioned already that I think the home's important, parental influence is significant. A lot of the research bears out if children aren't being engaged effectively in the home, then the chance of them growing up with faith and having faith are next to nil. David Voas would also say in terms of other stats that he uses to talk about particularly growth or lack of it in the Anglican Church. But then this also chimes with a book that came out just in 2020 as well, funnily enough, by David Sinos' Little Theologians, that children aren't simply passive consumers of theology. And the challenge for us, I think, in terms of seeking to make disciples and share the good news, is children and young people are interpreting what happens around them and using that to make sense of the world and have their own theology and understanding of it. Kenda Creasy-Dean writes about this in Almost Christian, where she basically says, look, we've passed on moral therapeutic deism. It's how we've sought to do this, and that means that's what young people have received. We've passed on a faith that is not really asking you to count the cost. So it's no wonder they don't count the cost and then they don't carry on coming along to church, because why bother? But what David Sinos is saying is, but regardless of that, the environment we're creating is shaping our children and young people. So if we ourselves as adults are passive recipients of what's going on at church and we don't live out that life together at home, children pick up on that. Children interpret that. Children see what is going on in that space and think, well, this is just something to do on a Sunday. And then because of COVID, I just want to dart back to the Good Childhood Report. It was the 10th year in 2021. This is what they put together. And just look at the difference in terms of the young people not happy with their lives. That's a massive increase since they first started this report. And yes, I think you could look at isolation in COVID, some of that stuff having a significant impact on children and young people and their well-being. And if we're going to engage effectively and we're going to seek to do mission in this secular age, we need to really consider as we're moving forward, how do we help young people with their mental health, their well-being, and also their sense of who they are in a world where so much has shifted and changed, even just in the last couple of years. My final piece of work, just to mention in 1 minute, is this piece of work that was just really recent. So Reframing Family Ministry. This was done just last year, and this did look at how ministries developed or not, what's happened during COVID. It was an international study that was done across Brazil, Canada, Australia, UK. The 4 key things I've put up there, and then my own reflections on those things. So that idea of collaboration or nexus, going back to the Nexus report. What I didn't mention, because I was rattling through it, was the Nexus report was focused on the church, home and school and the engagement between those 3 different spaces and how well collaboration does or doesn't take place. And it's been poor, was what this finding found from this Reframing Family Ministry survey and the study that was done during COVID. But I'm asking a question there, is that a feature of the pandemic or is that the norm? The connection between those 3 spaces is still not good. Parents not feeling equipped, lacking confidence. Overwhelm is the key thing I was thinking. There's so much stuff that was going on during COVID. It's just one more thing to try and do. And so I wonder if that was part of what was going on during COVID, but also that sense of parents lacking confidence. Where's that coming from, and how do we need to address that as the church to give parents greater confidence at doing faith with their children alongside them in the home? And children just as passive recipients of what is being done to them and for them. That came out in the report, but I would challenge that. I'd say, are they though? Because based on Faith in the Nexus report and also David Sinos's book and the research that he's done in Little Theologians, that would challenge that idea they're passive recipients. More is going on than that. And then church leaders, parachurch, need to respond. And that was interesting in that report. It didn't mention denominations. And I find that really fascinating. We've allowed denominations to lead on this ministry in the church in the UK. So BRF, Parenting for Faith, Care for the Family, have done their brilliant kitchen table project. YFC are beginning to, I'm not saying much more about them because I'm promised not to, but they're shifting some of their focus and looked at how they're engaging well with family and children and thinking differently about their practice because of research. The Church of England and other major denominations have had this stuff, certainly the Church of England for the last decade to 15 years have known this is happening. To what extent have we shifted our practice? I've landed just about. I just want to share this slide at the end. And I found this really helpful in thinking about what's my current practice, what's old practice, what do I need to adapt, get rid of, think about in terms of how I navigate the way forward. Some of the things we've introduced during COVID might need to stay and remain. Some of the things that we were doing pre-COVID Do we need to go back to them? Were they working? Can we properly look at that instead of just, well, they're sacred cows, so we've got to keep them forever? What's been working, and how do we invest in that? And for me, I found this little chart from the Royal Society of Arts quite a helpful way of navigating my own work and what I'm prioritising moving forward. I'm finished. Thanks for staying with me. I haven't looked at how many people are still left in the conversation, so hopefully you've stuck with that. But all of the stats for me talk about the significance of engaging well with the home, the family mattering, and the need for us to be more intergenerational and gathered in our understanding of who we are as the church, not siloed off into separate age groups. And for me, there's some questions that will come, I think, that I sent through earlier to Gareth. And I'd love it if we engage with those together. Thanks for listening.